Hello. So today we're going to talk about speciation. And first off, we have to talk about the difference between microevolution and macroevolution. So previously, when we talked about the four mechanisms of evolution, that was microevolution. So microevolution is on a short time span, a short time scale. We're talking about differences between generations, right? And these, like I said, include the four mechanisms of evolution. Macroevolution is what we talk about when we're talking about speciation. How do we get new species? And this is occurring over a very long time span. So the major difference here between microevolution and macroevolution is time and how much time has passed, right? So macroevolution is the cumulative effects of microevolution, so of those mechanisms of evolution. And today we're going to talk about that. So essentially, how do we get new species? Right? So these new species arrive via isolation mechanisms, right? So we're talking about extrinsic isolation, which I will define in a second, intrinsic isolation, and then within intrinsic isolation, we're talking about prezygotic isolation and then postzygotic isolation. And we're going to go through all of these mechanisms together. Right? So there are three major modes of speciation. There's allopatric speciation, parapatric speciation, and sympatric speciation, right? And patry is talking about fatherland, right? Allopatric means that they're separate, parapatric means that they're side by side, and sympatric, you already know the root sym, means that they share a fatherland or they share the same area. So the first one is allopatric speciation, and allopatric speciation means that they are separated somehow by a geographical barrier. That geographical barrier can be an ocean, it can be a river, it can be a freeway, anything, a mountain range. Somehow they're separated, and so they're evolving in two separate areas, right? They were together at one point, now they're separate, and they're evolving in those separate areas. Okay. Next is parapatric speciation, and this means that they're essentially speciating side by side from one another. And a really good example of this is this wheat that grows in pastures. Sorry, it's vernal grass. It grows in pastures, and depending on sort of what the zinc is in the soil, they have different tolerance for that zinc. So if they're in the pasture, they have a very low tolerance for the zinc, but they could be right next to a mine area, and in that mine area, they have a very high tolerance for zinc. So they're diverging separately right next to each other. Right? And then the next one is sympatric speciation. And so when we talk about sympatric speciation, we're mostly talking about intrinsic isolation mechanisms, right? So let me define these two terms for you first. Extrinsic, we already talked about. That's geographic isolation. We also call it vicariance, right? So these are barriers where they can't interbreed with each other because they live in different places. And I do want to mention right now that we are talking about the biological species concept. And there's a little bit of an activity for you in homework about those. So just keep in mind that we're talking about the biological species concept. So in this case, they have to be able to reproduce in order to be the same species. All right. So this is where we get allopatric speciation. And then when we talk about intrinsic isolation, these are things that are happening when they are not separated geographically. So it could be sympatric speciation, okay? But it can also be when species come back together from being separated for a long period of time. So after they've been allopatrically speciated, when they come back together, why aren't they the same species? Right? So we can talk about that a little bit more in lecture if you want to talk about sort of what that means. Okay, so let's get into these intrinsic isolation mechanisms. Right? So we're going to start with the most broad of these intrinsic isolation mechanisms. Okay, And for this, I want to sort of think about when those species that have been speciated separately, when they come back together, why can't they mate? Okay, and a lot of this has to do with how much time they've been separated, right? So in prezygotic isolation, that means that there has not been a zygote formed. So remember, a zygote is a fusion of an egg and a sperm into a unicellular zygote that then grows into another organism, at least in the terms of animals. Okay, so prezygotic isolation means that these are happening before a zygote forms. Okay, so the first one is ecological isolation. And ecological isolation means that they may be in the same area. Remember, we're talking about sympatric speciation in that case. They may be in the same area, but they don't necessarily live in the same habitat, right? So you could be ecologically isolated by if you are, let's say, a bird and you live in the trees versus on the ground, you may be in the same area, but you're separated ecologically. Okay, so they're in the same place right now, but there's some other barrier that they can't mate, and that barrier is ecological. All right. The next one is temporal isolation. And when I say temporal, I want you to think of time. Right? So temporal isolation means that now they're in the same area. They may be in the same habitat, so they're now no longer ecologically isolated, but now they are temporally isolated, meaning that maybe one of them reproduces in the fall and one of them reproduces in the spring. So while they're not reproducing with the other one, they're not like necessarily attracted to the other one. Okay, so they're isolated by time now, right? And that can be, like I said, seasons. It can also be daytime and nighttime, right? Maybe one's nocturnal and one's diurnal or crepuscular. Like they're not active at the same time, so they're not going to be able to reproduce. Next is behavioral isolation. So now they're in the same area, they're active at the same times. Now they're not attracted to one another because of behavior. This could be different songs, different dances, or courtship rituals. For whatever reason, they're not actively attracted to one another. Right? Next is mechanical. So now they're in the same area, they're now active at the same time, now they're attracted to one another, and now with mechanical isolation, that means that they just don't fit together. Either one of them gets harmed or they both get harmed while they're trying to mate. Their parts just don't fit together, so now they can't reproduce because they're not mechanically compatible. Right? Next is gametic isolation. So now, active at the same time, right, in the same area, attracted to one another, now their parts fit, but now their egg and their sperm can't fuse together, right? And so remember that eggs have a coat around them essentially, and the sperm have enzymes in the head of the sperm that penetrate through that coating, but it's a lock and key mechanism, so they have to have the right enzymes to penetrate through the right eggs. So if they don't have those enzymes, they can't come together. Okay? And remember, this is still prezygotic because we haven't formed a zygote yet. All right? Next, let's move on to the postzygotic isolation. So postzygotic isolation is isolation that happens after a zygote's formed. So all of those other prezygotic isolation mechanisms have been met, right? So active in the same place, same time, they're attracted, they fit together. Now their gametes confused, but now what happens to the zygote after that? The first one of these is hybrid inviability. That essentially just means that the zygote dies very early, there's a miscarry, the zygote doesn't form, or the embryo doesn't fully develop, right? And then the last one of those is hybrid infertility. And this one you're probably the most familiar with. Mules are a really good example of this. Ligers, wolfins. So all of those are hybrids, meaning that they are a mixture, right, between one species and another species, but that hybrid can't mate with any other hybrids, right? And it also can't mate with either of the parent populations. So if it can't mate with any of those, then it can't be a different species. It's a hybrid, okay? So hopefully that made all of that a little bit more clear, and I will see you next time. Bye.